Welcome. I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson, the Director of Shelter Solutions at Maddie's Fund. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people and that you can use in your shelter. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Ellis, who is board certified by the Animal Behavior Society as a certified applied animal behaviorist and is certified in shelter behavior CAT by the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants, or the IAABC, and is the Director of Behavior at Toronto Humane Society. We're very lucky to have her here today. She earned her PhD in animal welfare at the Atlantic Veterinary College, University of Prince Edward Island, where she conducted her research on methods for reducing stress in shelter cats. Her work has been published widely in peer-reviewed journals, and she has presented at many national and international conferences, particularly on feline stress and elimination behavior. She has recently authored 2 chapters for a new edition of the leading textbook on the behavior and welfare of shelter animals. And Dr. Ellis, I've heard your name for years, and it's so nice to finally meet you, and we're glad to have you here. Welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here. Obviously, Maddie's is such an institution in our field. So I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Jacqueline Ellis, Director of Behavior at Toronto Humane Society, as advertised. And today I'll be talking about my paper, Beyond Doing Better, Ordinal Rating Scales to Monitor Behavioral Indicators of Well-Being in Cats, which was published in the journal Animals. It's about 4 scales I developed to help monitor the well-being, primarily working with fear, of our cats using behavioral evidence. We've been using these scales for a few years now, and I have found them so helpful in managing the cases of particularly of our more fearful cats. I've shared them with a few other organizations and a few other conferences, and people have been really, really taken with them. So I'm really excited to share them with you today. They are relatively simple, which means they can be used by a broad range of people. And after some introductory training, they have excellent interobserver reliability and agreement. I truly believe that these can be a big help to other organizations that are struggling with some of the same problems I was before developing these. So despite our best efforts, shelters are a scary place. Due to their relative lack of exposure to novelty, the shelter environment can be particularly stressful for cats. It's the responsibility of shelter staff and volunteers to do everything within our power to ensure that cats have the best possible life while in our care. Primarily, we do this using environmental enrichment, behavior modification, and in some cases, medication. But it's imperative that we not only use these strategies, but also evaluate their impact and make adjustments to their plan if improvements are not being made. At THS, we've been doing this for years through monitoring the comments of our volunteers in our human-animal interaction enrichment sessions. However, the language used in these comments was sometimes vague. Volunteers were not consistent in the language that they used or in what behaviors they were reporting. And sometimes their comments were not even really about the animal's behavior at all. So in accordance with the title of the paper, one big one that I saw all the time was, "She's doing better." And my initial response to that is, of course, well, doing better at what? What behavior is improving? And is it improving to the point where the animal's welfare could be said to be good, or is it still bad? It's just less bad than it used to be. Another example is, it was a good day for her. Okay, so is that a good day overall, or is it just less bad than yesterday? What does that look like? And then finally, I gave him the treats and he wiggled the wand toy. Excuse me, I gave him the treats and I wiggled the wand toy. Did he eat the treats? Did he play with the wand toy? And he let me pet him. Did he enjoy petting, or was he simply tolerating it? So as a result, I found the information just insufficient to really interpret the cat's well-being and whether or not they were improving. But it's hard to blame the volunteers for not providing the information I needed, as I hadn't properly instructed them in what I was looking for. So I needed a solution. I asked myself what I really wanted to know and how I wanted them to report it. There are so many pieces of information that could be used to evaluate the well-being of a cat, but I decided to pare it down to just a few specific behaviors, and I really wanted to standardize the language that they use to report these behaviors. I also wanted to standardize the conditions under which they were collecting this information as much as possible, understanding, of course, that within a shelter environment, complete standardization is impossible. I also wanted to find a way that I could understand all this information quickly, saving me the time from reading full paragraphs, but still getting a good picture of the cat's well-being and progress at a glance. So to me, the obvious answer was representing these behaviors numerically. But what was the best method for measuring this behavior? There's a couple of options we can use. Continuous behavior observation is frequently used in research, but it's really just not practical for use in a shelter environment. It's very resource intensive and very time consuming. Another option would be presence absence behavior, and this is very practical for use in a shelter as it requires very little training or resources or time, but it lacks the sensitivity to capture subtle changes over time. Although I will say we do use presence absence behaviors, and I will report the way that we do this at the end of this presentation, depending on how much time I take to give the first part of the presentation. But it's not present in the paper that we're discussing today. So for my purposes, ordinal rating scales seem to be the best choice as they can represent various levels of intensity, can be measured live, can efficiently summarize a lot of data, and can reveal patterns of improvement or deterioration quite easily. But they need to be reliable. We need to make sure if we're using an ordinal rating scale that if I give the cat a 4 for whatever behavior, that my 4 is meaningful and it's the same as what your 4 would be. If our scores are not in sync with each other, they just become meaningless. Within the field of assessing well-being in cats, ordinal data is already being used. The cat stress score, or CSS, is ubiquitous within the research, and it sets a good precedent for using this type of data across time and across individual raters to communicate objective information about a cat's behavior and emotional state. In the cat stress score, cats are assigned a score from 1, fully relaxed, to 7, terrorized, across 11 different postural or behavioral categories. While this rating system is widely used, and I've published many papers using this scale, it has been criticized for not being sensitive enough to recognize certain expressions of stress, for example, feigned sleep, for lacking a published training guide, and for variable or often not even reported interobserver reliability. So with all this in mind, I created 4 ordinal rating scales. The first is the fear, anxiety, and stress score. Technically, of course, I didn't actually create this one, but simply adapted it from the Fear Free Pets program. I decided to use this scale instead of the cat stress score because the Fear Free Pets program has a companion piece for dogs and for a number of other species as well. So that way we could use the same scale across species and it would be easier for staff to be able to interpret what the scores mean. The next scale is the response to petting score. I started to notice that while enjoyment of petting often tracked, that is to say, changed in alignment with the fear, anxiety, and stress, wasn't always the case. Sometimes we found cats that remained very high in their FAS, but they loved petting. Or the opposite, they actually had pretty low FAS, but they just hated petting. So we thought it would be wise to create a score that captured this difference, that was be able to pick up this nuanced difference in the behaviors that they were exhibiting. And likewise with the next one, which is participation in play. We found, similar to RTP, that there are many cats that their change in play came faster or slower than the changes we saw in their fear, anxiety, and stress, or their changes in response to petting. And also, it was very useful for us to have these RTP scores and PIP scores because we were able to know whether we would be able to use those, whether it be petting or play, as reinforcers for some of the other training that we were working on. So having these values for them was very helpful. And finally, the food intake summary score. The relationship between food intake and stress is well documented, especially in cats. But often so much is tracked about food intake that it can be really difficult to know at a glance whether or not they're actually eating well. I don't know how everyone else tracks it, but we were tracking wet food, dry food, percentage of food intake of both of those things at multiple meals per day. So there's so much data that if you're just trying to look at information and get an idea if they're eating well at a drop of a hat, it was a little bit more complicated than that. So this score gave us the ability to interpret a little bit more quickly. So all 4 of these scores were developed on a scale of 0 to 5, where 0 was the best possible score and 5 was the worst possible score. I developed them, and then I trialed them out with some of our feline training assistants for a few months, made some adjustments based on their feedback, and then rolled out the program with a group of select volunteers. And my hypothesis, of course, was that after training them on these scales, that the observers would have excellent interobserver reliability and agreement with each scale. So these are the methods that I went through to do this. I'm going to have a subsequent slides, 1 or more subsequent slides on each of these bullet points. But basically, first, I created and refined the scales. Then I standardized the interactions as much as possible in a shelter environment under which they'd be collecting these scales, trained the raters, and then tested the raters. So what were the scales? So first we have, of course, the adapted fear, anxiety, and stress score. I imagine almost all of you are familiar with this graphic, excuse me, taken from Fear Free Pets. But you may notice, the keen eye may notice that this is slightly different. In the Fear Free Pets program, each of these white blocks has often multiple numbers. It might say 1 to 2 in one block, and then 2 to 3 in another block. And this is fine for the purposes it was developed for. It's very appropriate for the purposes it's developed for. But we wanted to look at kind of more precise and subtle changes between scores. So we just adapted it a little bit so that each one of the white blocks is associated with only one number. And then in the actual training, we provide more than just this infographic. There's a lot more tables of what types of behaviors would constitute each of the different scores. And in all of the trainings, there's video examples of cats exhibiting each score so that the trainers can be confident that they are giving the score that would associate with each of these correctly. Next is the response to petting score. And you can see on the side there, they go from 0 to 5, 0 being the best score. And in this particular scale, a 0 is approach you and actively interact with your attempts to pet them. An example of what that might look like could be tail up, maybe rubbing against you, could be headbutting, maybe cheerful vocalizations, may even be purring. And then a 5, which is the worst score, would be flee from your attempts to touch or lunge at your attempts to touch, and everything between. The participation in play score, 0 to 5 again, 0 being the best, and the 0 in this particular scale is enthusiastically playing, moving all around the environment. And the 5 is no interest in playing or actively retreats from your attempts to play. The food intake summary score, of course, this is not necessarily going to make a lot of sense if you track the cat's food intake in a way that's different than what we do. But again, 0 to 5, 0 being the best, which in this case would be 8 at least 3/4 of either wet or dry at both meals, because we monitor the last 2 meals that the cat had access to. And 5 is 8, none or nibbling. So those were the scales. Next, I aimed to standardize the interactions under which they were collecting them, or they would collect them. So the first, as with any interaction at THS, we say, do your homework. So that means reading the instructions provided for the individual cat. We have an electronic human-animal interaction tracker, and each animal has specific instructions. So this says, Mika and Norman are housed together. Mika is friendly, but takes time to enjoy petting and getting overstimulated. Please go slow with considerate approach. Blah, 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 blah. It might say things like, exercise the 3 pet rule. So the person has to read the instructions and know what it is we would like them to do with the cat. But after reading the instructions, it's important to read the previous comments. So these are comments from the previous volunteers. These might give you more up-to-date information about the cat's behavior. We do update these instructions from time to time, but never at the speed with which volunteers are seeing them. So you might get something that's a little bit more current, or something new that a volunteer's found really works well with the cat, but we haven't added it to the instructions yet. So we have them read through those previous volunteer comments. And then finally, read the cat, because no matter what any of the comments or the instructions say, the cat themselves is going to be the best tool you can use to understand how to go forward with your interactions. Even the nicest cat might have just had a vaccine and maybe they're in a grumpy mood. So even if it says, no behavior concerns noted, super friendly, they might still be having a bad day. So after we do our homework, the next thing we do is proceed with a considerate approach, making yourself seem as non-threatening as possible, encouraging the cat to interact with you as much as possible. And then pairing your presents with things they enjoy. So this might easily be food. Food is a good one. We like to use baby food, chicken and broth, churros, temptations. And then we really like to emphasize the cat, allowing the cat to exercise their own agency and encouraging their active participation in the interaction and their choice to approach you whenever possible. So this is a video of Lilith doing a treat trail. This is the very first time that she actually emerged from hiding in front of a person. You're all experts at treat trails, but I always like to feed people my best tips, which is to throw the treat a couple of inches in front of their face, wait until they're done eating it, looking up for the next treat, and then just throwing it 2 inches closer to you so that they're really extra motivated by that, that motion to come forward for their next treat. I also always advocate for people to practice their aim beforehand so they don't accidentally by getting the treat too close to them or accidentally having it bounce back into their face.
Good girl. There we go. Good girl. It's a very nice kitty. Yeah. Good girl. You could give it sweetheart. That's very good girl.
All right. And then finally, play. For some of our more fearful cats, I do find often play is one of the biggest things that just helps them shake that stress off. If you can encourage them to play. And especially for more fearful cats, I like to encourage more low-key play strategies at first so you don't scare them off before graduating to more energetic types of play. I like to drag a wand toy without an actual thing at the end. So it's just the wand and string. Gradually dragging that in front of them, I find has really good success. Or using the actual butt of the wand toy under a towel or a blanket, something like that. Then they're supposed to conduct the cat's formal behavior modification plan if they are on one. We have a couple standard ones that we routinely use. The first is a desensitization and counter conditioning to touch plan. And we have a couple of different clicker training behaviors we teach, often just target training, but sometimes stationing. So I have a video of the training that they get for the desensitization and counter conditioning to touch plan, which I will share now. So you might think that was just an already socialized kitten. I will say that I was just doing a really good job of keeping her under threshold, which is why she never really reacted with great amounts of fear. But if I tried to reach out to her and pet her at the beginning of that, she definitely would have fled. Of course, we do this, doing that with Lennon took about 20 minutes, which is unusual. When we perform this protocol with older cats, it definitely takes much longer. And even all of the other cats in her litter took much, much longer. But that is the protocol we use with cats, no matter their age, even though it said with kittens on the beginning of the video. So after doing all of that, we asked them to record their data. So here is a little snapshot of we just use Excel to track the data that they input. And you can see in the columns, the first one's the date, then the time, then the name of the person who conducted the interaction. And then you can see the RTP score, FAS score, PIP score, and FIS score. And this is great because even though they're just numbers, I can get a pretty good picture of what those interactions were like. And not only that, I can graph it. Anyone who knows me knows I love a good graph. I just feel like they do such a great job of illustrating what's going on. And here in this picture, you can see that the cat on day 1 had some pretty high for all of the scores, but gradually over time really reduced. And we can pretty much guarantee that this cat had pretty good welfare by the end of this 7 days. So next, we wanted to train the raters. So for the paper, I trained 16 volunteer training assistants. I will say, since this paper's been published, I have now trained 52 volunteers to be performing this for us. I usually run 2 interactive live sessions in this training per year, but now that the virtual training is available, and more on that later, I may be able to do many, many more. So the training itself is 3 2-hour sessions. The first training was teaching them about the standardized interactions I wanted them to conduct and the BMODs that they would be working on. The second of these sessions was training them on the FAS and RTP rating systems. And the third was training them on the PIP and FIS training systems. And after the second session and the third session, they would be sent some tests. And so they had to complete those before moving on to the next training. So the trainings themselves were different trainings on each of the ordinal scales. And we talked about the purpose of the training. We talk about a description of what the training is and, of what the scale is. And then 2 videos of cats exhibiting the behaviors on each level of the scale. So they could have video representations of what we were talking about. Then I always like to preempt the more commonly asked questions by kind of walking them through how I would go about answering those. And then there's time for questions and discussion among the group. I will also say that this is currently our volunteer program that has the highest volunteer satisfaction rating. I feel that the volunteers in this program really, because of the training, get a great idea of how their work is directly impacting the welfare of others, and they have a great community through these group training sessions. So now I'm just going to show you a couple of the videos that would be in the training that they would watch. So for example, in the RTP training session, we'll have 2 videos at each scale, or excuse me, at each score. So for RTP 0, as a reminder, the description was approach you and actively interact with your attempts at petting them. They may have their tail up, they may be rubbing against you, they may be headbutting, they may have cheerful vocalizations, and they may even be purring. So here is a video of a cat who is exhibiting an RTP of 0. You can see she approached me even before I start touching her. She's pushing her body into my hand. She's making some biscuits. She's rubbing up against the environment. Turns around, coming back for more petting. So that is a cat who is actively enjoying petting, and she is an RTP of 0. Next, we have an RTP of 2. Cats in this category stay where they are, but show mild signs of enjoyment. So maybe they lift their chin slightly when you pet them and push back into your hand ever so gently. And they often, but not always, have a tense body. RTP 2 is probably the hardest one to get from a video because so much of it you really feel in person from the cat actually pushing back into your hand. But I think that with a little practice, you can really see it even in a video. So this cat starts off not showing any really signs of whether they're enjoying or not enjoying it. But after a little while, he extends his chin for a little bit more petting, and Shannon tells me she could really feel him pushing back into her hand there. We are still seeing some signs of FAS very clearly. But again, while FAS and RTP often track, they're not always anything at the same. And here Shannon said she was able to feel him pushing back into her hand again. All right, and RTP4, so not the highest, but the second highest. Cats in this category stay where they are, but show signs of not wanting to be touched. So perhaps they flinch when your hand approaches them. Perhaps they flatten their ears in response to your hand. Perhaps they have dilated pupils in response to your hand, and they often, but not always, have a tense body. So here I'm just trying to give this cat some treats to help her form a positive association with my presence, but she is not eating them. Giving her my finger to sniff just as a polite introduction. And with this cat, I decided to start petting with a wand just for gauging the reaction and for safety. And for the record, I would not really advocate for reaching into cats' boxes or petting a cat that doesn't seem to want it or is not enjoying it. And you'll see some evidence of that later on when you see some of our data. But for the purposes of this training, we did need some video examples. So now I'm letting her sniff my finger again. I go to petting her. She did shirk back from my hand a bit there. And as I'm petting her, you can see that her ears have really flattened. And when I remove my hand, that ear goes straight back up. So that is a clear sign that she is not about what's happening. Okay, so after they went through all the trainings, and I've just given you 3 video examples in this presentation today, but in the actual course, there's many, many more. So after training the raters on these systems, I then had to give them their tests. And so for each ordinal scale, there were 30 different videos for each. Well, for the FIS, I suppose they weren't videos, but still. And they had to watch each video and score them from 0 to 5 on that particular scale. And then I took the answers back and compared them to the reference standard, which was my score, for agreement using a linear weighted kappa, and for reliability using an interclass correlation coefficient. So to investigate the interobserver agreement, that is to say the same value is achieved if measuring is performed by different observers, and reliability, the ability to differentiate among subjects of these scales, the test results of the first 3 cohorts, so these 16 volunteers, were analyzed. And interobserver agreement of these participants were compared with my score, assessed using these 2 scales, and their results were interpreted according to a couple of different systems that exist in the literature. So for the linear weighted kappa, we used Landis and Koch, I can never say that. We used their interpretation metric, which is 0 to 2 is slight agreement, 0 to 0.2 is slight agreement, 0.2 to 0.4 is fair agreement, 0.4 to 0.6 is moderate agreement, 0.6 to 0.8 is substantial agreement, and 0.8 to 1 is almost perfect agreement. So now I'm going to reveal the actual results that we got from our 16 volunteers. You'll see 1 bar for the FAS scale, 1 bar for the RTP scale, 1 bar for the PIP scale, and 1 bar for the FIS scale. And this is the average linear weighted kappa for these 16 volunteers. And you can see that we really did achieve almost perfect, according to this scale, agreement, which is, I mean, so fantastic. Anyone who writes papers on these types of statistics would be drooling at these results. And for the reliability, we used Koo and Lee's scale of interpretation, where 0 to 0.5 is poor, 0.5 to 7 is moderate, 0.7 to 0.9 is good, and 0.9 to 1 is excellent. And again, you'll see a bar for our volunteers, FAS, RTP, PIP, FIS scores, the average of those 16 volunteers. And again, we hit gold and we achieved excellent reliability for all of the scales, which is just better than I could have hoped for. So Now that I've hopefully convinced you that these scales have excellent reliability between raters, I want to show you a little bit how we use them to manage actual cases. So it allows for quick identification of patterns, it shows responses to interventions, and it helps to make or justify pathway decisions. I have a couple of case studies here for you. So here's cat 1. Cat 1 represents a cat who has a fairly typical response to the shelter environment. They have an initial elevated stress response to the shelter housing, with gradual improvement over an approximately 5-day habituation period. And the fact that all 4 scales reduce in a similar timeline in this case really helps to support their construct validity. Here's cat 2. This represents a cat who experienced a reduction in stress response to an intervention. So in this case, the cat expressed an initial stress response similar to that of cat 1. But in this case, there was no significant reduction observed in a comparable time frame. Instead, a reduction was observed only after the administration of gabapentin. So that's days 5 to 7, illustrated on the graph with a green background. As these data represent only one case, of course, it's not possible to definitively claim that the reduction in the 4 scales resulted from the gabapentin. But this case does show how these 4 scales can be used as outcome measures in scientific evaluations of the success or failure of different interventions. And this can help us with case management decisions in cases in the future that present with similar behaviors. And finally, cat 3. So cat 3 represents the cats who, again, experienced an initial stress response to shelter housing, but without the degree of improvement seen by either cat 1 or cat 2. Cat 3 exhibited a reduction in FIS, but increased food intake alone is not enough to interpret the psychological well-being of the cat as being acceptable. Interventions such as environmental management, so for example, out-of-cage space and a social companion, formalized behavior modification, utilizing desensitization and counterconditioning, and psychopharmaceuticals were employed but not represented on this graph. But none of them were successful in improving the cat's psychological well-being. So these data, in combination with information we got from the cat's intake form, as well as the medical examinations, were useful in determining that this cat was not appropriate for placement in a traditional home environment and was eventually placed through a barn cat program and is still happily helping them out with their mouse problem. So if you think this scale is something you would find useful, you'll be pleased to know that as of today, a recorded virtual version of the training system is available on our website for free. Either of the website links that you see on this slide can take you to the course. So this course will give you an overview of the system and the trainings and skills assessments for the RTP, the adapted FAS, and the PIP. I chose not to include the FIS training because it's just unlikely that it will be as universally applicable since not everyone tracks food intake in the same way as we do at THS. And in fact, we're just in the process of changing the way we track food intake. So I have just stopped using it with new cases in our care, although I am very likely to develop an adapted scale for the new way we're tracking food intake in the near future. So in conclusion, I have developed 4 behavioral rating systems, and I believe they'll be very helpful in evaluating well-being of shelter cats, or really any type of cat anywhere. And it's really helped us out in the way that we are able to think about case management for our cats. Also found that with some initial training, these have shown to have excellent interobserver agreement and reliability. And monitoring scores on these scales can be super helpful in evaluating the success of environmental enrichment and behavior modification efforts and the responses to specific interventions. So since we have plenty of time left, I am going to tell you about these extra bonus methods of ways we collect, ways we monitor behavioral data at THS for our cats. So none of this is in the paper, but it is, I find, just so useful, and I would be bursting at the seams to share it as much as I can. So I mentioned earlier presence absence data, and we do use that in our data tracking. So we use what I call a summary score of presence absence of key behaviors during these behavior modification sessions. So we look at a couple of key desirable behaviors. So eating in front of you, playing in front of you, and being out in the open, so not being under cover in front of you. And if the cat exhibits any of those, they get a +1. And the undesirable behaviors we monitor are swat or bite attempts, or successful if that happens, and hissing and growling. And if they're exhibiting any of those, they get a -1. So this, again, you probably recognize this, something like this from a previous slide. We track the date, the time, the individual who actually conducted the session. And then you'll see here that they have to enter a -1 if the cat swat bite, a -1 if the cat hiss growl, +1 if the cat ate a treat or really ate any food, a +1 if the cat played, and a +1 if the cat's out in the open. And then that column that says summary score, that's just a summation of all the negative and positive points. So the lowest possible score the summary score could be is -2 if they exhibit both undesirable behaviors and none of the desirable behaviors. And the highest possible score it can be is a 3 if the inverse is true. And so here we're also able to graph it. And so you can see over time that this cat's summary score has really improved. So we can say that at very least we're doing right by this cat. And bonus method number 2. So we actually also track the success or failure of our behavior modification efforts. So the first thing we do is define the steps so people know what to score. So if a cat gets X far in the plan, you assign them that score. And we only record the last successful step. So if someone tries to move one step further and the cat backs away, they wouldn't get that score. They'd get the last successful step. So for example, the video you saw of Lennon the kitten, we have defined waypoints in that plan that as soon as they reach those different scores, then we know that they've gotten to the next score on the system. Again, this is a lot, but I just want to show you that we do record everything together just in Excel. We have the date, the time, the name of the individual who conducted it. There's our presence absence behaviors. Then there's our summary score. Then you'll see we have our RTP, our FAS, our PIP, and our FIS, and they record those scores in there. You'll notice, as I mentioned before, we do not want people petting cats that don't like it. So a lot of NAs is I didn't feel like it was something that was in this cat's best interest, so I did not push it. I love to see NAs. And then here, this last column is the DSCC score. So while FAS, RTP, PIP, and FIS are 0 to 5, where 0 is the best possible score and 5 is the worst possible score, for some reason I went the other direction with the DSCC score, and now I just have to live with that every day, where 0 is the worst score and 10 is the best score. And again, we can graph it, and we can see that this cat over time had tremendous improvement in their DSCC. It's not linear. We rarely see linear improvement. We see setbacks, we see good days, we see bad days, but we're able to see over time that this cat is improving in their interest in petting, which is fantastic. And the great thing about this is that we can track it along with other things in the plan. So we can say, this huge improvement here, for example, what happened on that day? Did they start on some behavior medications? Did they get moved to out of cage space? Did they get a social companion? And then we can use that information to help guide us in making decisions in subsequent cases that are presenting similarly. Similarly, we can look at this one score where it went way down and say, what happened there? And they have the comments section in this document as well. And we might look in that section and say, there was construction on the room next door when I was visiting the cat. And then we'd look at that low score and say, that's probably because of the construction. And we can make some interpretations of the data based on that. So that's everything that I have to share with you today. I am finishing a little bit earlier than planned, but I'm happy to take any questions. I'd love to have a discussion, see what anyone thinks about this. And we do have the link to the training. This is the bit.ly link. There's also another version of the link, I believe, in your chat. Encourage you to take the training if you're interested. It is live as of today, and it'll be good to go. And then my email address is present on the screen here as well, in case anyone wants to contact me afterwards with any questions. So I will stop sharing my screen now and get to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis. This was absolutely incredible. I'm just so impressed with all the work that you've done and how much thought you put into making this be practical and usable for organizations that want to take better care of their cats. We're getting lots of positive feedback in the chat as well.
Great.
Let's jump into some questions. The first starts with a comment. Thank you for such great information and videos. Do you track agency or sense of control for your kitties through different choices you offer to them? I am curious if this dimension has been defined like the others in your study.
No. So, short answer, no. Longer answer, that's a great idea. One thing I struggled with when I was developing the system is there's just so many wonderful things we could track that there's no end to the number of scales and the number of columns I could put on that document. I wanted to try to keep things approachable. Some of our volunteers aren't terribly tech savvy and can be overwhelmed by a lot of things at first. So I do think that is something that there's a lot of merit in. I don't think it lends itself quite as easily to an ordinal rating scale, but there might be a good way to track it, and that's more simple, perhaps in a presence absence way. But as of right now, we do not have anything that monitors that. But there is, as I mentioned, that comment section that every one of these sessions, they do fill out how it went, things that worked for them, things that didn't work for them, so they can enter that type of information in a more qualitative way.
Great, thank you. Next question, does Toronto Humane have a similar program for dogs?
Fabulous question. So we are looking into something like that. In fact, I am elbow deep in something like that right now. But one thing I've really discovered for dogs is that cats primarily stay in their one enclosure. And so there's only one environment that you're really assessing them in. For dogs, obviously, they can behave quite differently in their run, in their kennel, than they do out on a walk. So I'm looking at perhaps recording their behaviors in more than one environment. So it's kind of complicating things. So I'm trying to do my best to keep it simple while still incorporating this next measure. But I will say I also work a lot with our special species. The main ones that we have are rabbits, guinea pigs, mostly rabbits and guinea pigs, but also rats, lots of different things. And I find that the system really lends itself well to working with those species. So I am also developing something for those species. It'll probably only be a 0 to 3 scale for them because I just find their behavior is not quite as demonstrative sometimes. I feel like I can say like that guy clearly enjoyed it and like that guy did not enjoy it and that guy was in the middle. So I'm probably going to have a system coming out for special species. And then I'm actively working on the dog one, but it just is a little bit more complicated.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Next question is about technology, and I think you answered some of this, but what technology do you use to track behavior? Is it part of your shelter management system or a separate system?
So it's a separate system. Wouldn't it be awesome? We use PetPoint. Wouldn't it be awesome if this information just went straight into their PetPoint account? But it does not. So we have a number of computer stations around our shelter for volunteers to use. We've had it for a while. We may be very fortunate that we have all those computer stations for them to be logging their information in our enrichment list, our human-animal interaction as enrichment list. So we just made sure that we also gave them access to these Excel documents on those computer stations. And the Excel documents we use Teams. So they live in Teams, so they're live documents. I'm sure we could also use Google Docs or something like that. But yeah, so we use Excel, and then we really mostly track this information for animals that we have concerns about. Could be in the future, we might be using this data for all of the animals, but really often the cats that are medically healthy, behaviorally sound, are there for just long enough to get their surgery and then they go out. So it's not terribly necessary. So we do track it just for those animals at this time.
Okay, thanks. So just because we had another question about how does every cat in the shelter get evaluated and receive a score every day? So the answer to that is no, you focus on the ones that you identify need help.
Yes, so we have a system in PetPoint. There's a way that an animal could be flagged pending behavior assessment. So anytime anyone notices a cat that could use a little extra care and support, they get flagged in our system. One of our trainers will assess the case and see if any of these systems would benefit them. Sometimes, as I'm sure many of you are aware, sometimes a cat's really stressed out on their first day, and even day 2 or day 3, they're much, much better. So if they're flagged at the end of the day on a Monday and the trainer assesses them on a Tuesday, sometimes they get there and they're like, actually, this cat's doing great. We don't need to do this. But if they do identify them as needing a little bit of extra care and support, they're identified in our system as a TLC case. And that way we can pull reports on them every day to make sure, no cat left behind. And those cats get the behavior tracking and welfare tracking.
Okay, thank you. And one more add-on technology question. Have you experimented with using the equivalent of Google Forms? I know Teams has a way of doing that so that volunteers can enter the data from their phones.
So volunteers can access this spreadsheet from their phones as well. So
Oh,
we
great.
don't use Google Forms or Teams Forms because that way, in my experience, and I am far from a technology expert, but in my experience, it's much more difficult to look at past data. So if you're entering the data on a cat, you really want to know what the data from the cat the last couple of days was. And that way you don't have to mess around with the back end of forms or anything like that.
Okay,
So
great.
yeah, we just do Excel in Teams, which people can access from their phones if they are so inclined. A lot of people like to not use their data and like to use the computers in the shelter, but yeah, either way is fine.
Okay. And on a practical basis, does that mean like if people do they tend to write down the numbers on paper and then take it to the computer and enter it in? Is that how practically it usually works?
So I think it would depend on the actual person if they have the phone in hand, if they're using their phone to access it. I know personally because I manage a lot of cases at the shelter, when I am doing a follow-up to see how an animal's doing, I go to the animal's enclosure. I always have my notebook with me and I do just jot it down because I'm jotting down a lot of other things. So I jot it down and then I enter it later. So I imagine that's how most people are doing it, but to be honest, I couldn't answer that question with 100% certainty.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are BMOD sessions conducted by staff only, or is this included in your volunteer training assistant program as well?
It's primarily our volunteer training assistants. So we do have, at this moment, we have one feline trainer on staff, and she mostly manages the cases and assigns the BMOD to the cats. And every once in a while, especially if she's doing their follow-up to see how they're doing, she'll conduct a BMOD session to get her own idea and her like eyes-on situation. But it's mostly the volunteer training assistants who do all of the BMOD. We have a fantastic crew. And as I mentioned, they really feel connected. The people in this program, in this volunteer program, feel very connected to THS. So I find this particular program has the lowest turnover rate too. So we tend to keep them long term. And we have many of the people in this program come multiple days a week. They're really committed to they love seeing the numbers on these graphs go down. They just love to see the difference that they're making in a graph because who doesn't love a graph?
I certainly love graphs, so I'm with you on that one. All right. So next, some of these questions, it's clear that people are really thinking about implementing this. And the next one is if you skip one of the 4 scores, like the RTP, then is the missing score averaged in as 0, or are the existing 3 scores added up and divided by 3 instead of 4?
So we actually, you know what, I'm going to share my screen again. If you look at this table here, which shows really good picture of what the data they enter looks like, we never actually average RTP, FAS, PIP, and FIS. When we look at a graph of these over time, there, we do look at them differently. So their own line, they are their own line. And there's many days, like you saw with the RTP, where people don't collect RTP data. Most of the other data we do get every day, unless there's the odd day someone just like forgot to press enter or something like that. But yeah, so these never get averaged. Now, the summary scores they're not averaged, but they're summed. So if somebody doesn't even try to play with the cat that day for one reason or another, and then therefore the cat gets a 0 because they didn't have the opportunity to play, so they of course didn't play, then that could impact the summary score, absolutely. But the ordinal rating scales, the RTP, FAS, PIP, and FIS, are not impacted by averages.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Next question is, did you consider including positive vocalizations like meowing in the presence absence score? I often see this included in assessing and tracking cat sociability.
Yeah, I did think about it. One reason I didn't was frustration behavior. So often we see those cats that are the most social, who are just frustrated in their enclosure. And so they're constantly giving attention-seeking meows, which are positive vocalizations. They're not necessarily indicative of positive welfare. So I didn't want to potentially up a score, make a cat score look so high, when actually it's mostly impacted by their frustration. Of course, we do I don't know what your shelters are like, but most of our TLC cases are fearful cats. We do get some, impulse control cats or petting aggression cats that get to our TLC list. But mostly we're working with cats who are fearful because despite our best efforts, the shelter is a scary place. But no, that's the reason I didn't track positive vocalizations. I definitely see a lot of situations where it would be warranted though.
Okay, thank you. And another question related to how scoring happens, and that is with regard to the FAS scale. And in my experience, a cat who is extremely fearful and frantically attempting to flee can be just as, if not more, stressed than a cat who is displaying aggression, but the outward manifestation of that stress is different. Yet on the FAS scale developed by Fear Free and adapted to yours, aggression is a 5 and severe fear and anxiety is a 4. What is your experience related to that scale?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And in the training, if for those of you who do decide to take the training, you see that a lot of the cats who are a 5 for FAS aren't necessarily exhibiting many of the other classic signs of FAS, right? Like say, especially some of the offensive aggression that you see, their ears are not back. Their tail is not necessarily tucked. Yet we're not seeing those traditional signs of FAS. Ultimately, I suppose I just didn't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I didn't want to reinvent the wheel 100%. I love fear-free pets, and so many shelters use their program already. All of our volunteers are trained with the fear-free shelters. So using a system that was already within their frame of reference seemed very logical. And is there a clear answer to who's more stressed, 4 or 5? Not necessarily. But it does seem like a logical place to start.
Yes, it definitely does. And I love what you've done with it. All right. Next question. What is the criteria? And I feel like you answered some of this already, but what is the criteria you use to select which cats are eligible for the modification program? Is it typically just for fearful cats? We have an assessment scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being the most outgoing. Would you wait until after the cat is assessed to select if this program is good for them?
Yeah, so we absolutely wait until the cat is assessed, because without the cat being assessed, we don't know if they would benefit from it, right? So it's not just fearful cats. Well, I should take a step back. Our TLC program is for cats that need a little bit of extra support. And same for dogs, same for rabbits, same for guinea pigs. Who needs extra support? In cats, often that is our fearful cats. But as I mentioned, we might see cats that have impulse control problems, or have petting aggression, or even out-of-box elimination qualifies for our TLC. Now, what actually support they need would vary greatly based on what their presenting concern is. So a cat that is overall very friendly, outgoing, but is going outside of the litter box, they're probably not going to get a desensitization and counter conditioning to touch if they already like petting, right? So we'll decide what exactly we're tracking based on what behaviors they're presenting with. And we have broad categories for that. Of course, we treat every animal like an individual, but we have standard starting points for different commonly presenting concerns. And so cats that we would put on this particular, so on this slide, I'm going to share my screen one more time. On this, this is a pretty standard setup. You'll see if a cat is exhibiting signs of fearfulness, we're probably going to give them all of this, unless they're fearful and they already love petting, but they'll probably get all of this. A cat who already loves petting will definitely get this part here, the summary score stuff. That's basically a part of another BMOD that we run, which is just positive association plan. Sometimes that's done before the cat will even eat in our presence. And once the cat will eat in our presence, then we add on the DSCC. But sometimes we use our positive association BMOD plan really just for cats we want to monitor. And those are often the cats with a background of aggression in the home, but we're not seeing it in shelter. We just want to keep tabs on making sure that we have documentation of if we are experiencing any of these warning behaviors. And so we might monitor those. Whereas if the cat's TLC for out-of-box elimination, we're probably not going to do any of this. We're just going to be tracking their litter box usage, and we have a standardized litter box plan for what we do to address different behaviors whether it's out-of-box defecation, urination, both, whether it's like what the intake profile says about how many litter boxes they had, if they had a preference for different stuff right in the home, all those different things. If we're going to go ahead with just giving them an extra litter box and hoping it works because their litter box, they weren't given enough litter boxes in the home. And that seems to be our best guess. Or if they were given, I don't know, clumping or those crystal litter box in their home, and we think, okay, well, maybe if we just gave them clumping clay, they'll just use the litter box. Maybe we try that. For some of our more challenging cases, we'll do a lot of preference tests with, especially if they present with arthritis. We'll definitely be going with some, like we use just cage bottoms, like crate bottoms for dog crates, and just we'll offer them a regular litter box and one of those dog crate bottoms with litter in it, and just see if they're like, oh, thank heavens, I don't have to step over it. And then we can get a little bit better information there. So I am not 100% sure that I answered your questions. I feel like I meandered around on that a lot, but overall, we definitely don't use the same data collection on everyone, just the appropriate data for the behavior concern that we feel that they are expressing.
Thank you. And I just feel that's so important when we have some standardized pieces like the assessment. I just feel it's so important to work with the individual because everyone is individual. So I'm so glad that you talked about that. Thank you.
And I think having standardized plans is so helpful for reducing decision fatigue in a shelter. No need to, again, reinvent the wheel every time you have a fearful cat. I'm probably going to do the same 4 things at least to start. So might as well just have that the standard. And then after collecting data about how those 4 standard things, how that helped the cat or didn't help the cat, then we can individualize it. Because if the main things work, then less mental load to be carried by our staff.
Yeah, and I think the other great thing about having a standardized plan is that then treatment can be started more quickly because
absolutely. Yeah,
great.
100%.
We had one comment from David related to the technology question and whether people enter it in notes and go back to the computer. And David, who's one of your amazing volunteers at Toronto Humane, he said, I don't take notes on the numbers because I'm entering them so shortly after the visit that remembering is easy. So thank you for that, David.
Hi, dear.
All right. Next question is, more often than not, I notice that if we wait a few months after cats are fixed, they tend to be more social towards humans, not just feeder friendly. What's your thought on this? Did you compare behaviors in relation to recently fixed versus cats that were fixed a long time ago?
So just to repeat the question to make sure I understood it, you found that once a cat is fixed, they more quickly become friendly towards touch and human interaction. Is that correct?
Yeah, they said that if we wait a few months after they're fixed and assess them a few months later, they tend to be more social towards people.
No, I mean, I have never looked at that. That's an interesting proposition. I would say I am personally of the opinion that despite our best efforts, shelter is awful, right? Like we do everything we can to make it great. I wish nothing more than for no cat to be in the shelter for a couple of months. Of course, we do have cases that last there for a couple of months, but certainly if a cat is not interested in human interaction for a couple of months and they're showing their intake profile and their medical exam suggests that through their history, and we know how they're like, whether they get to cope with this, that they'd be appropriate for alternative placement. I am definitely one to advocate for alternative placement when appropriate. I have great relationships with so many of the places I've placed cats to, and I'm constantly getting photos of them and how they're enjoying their environments. There's one brewery that we placed a cat in, and the cat still doesn't want to actually physically interact with people, but she's fallen in love with one of the brewers. And he definitely put in his dues to get her love, but she's never touched him. But wherever he goes around the brewery, she just toddles around the rafters and follows him everywhere. And I just think stories like that are so heartwarming. And I feel that there's really nothing wrong with pursuing something like that if the cat's behavioral history and their medical support that. But in answer to your specific question, if spaying and neutering makes cats socialized more quickly, I don't know. I bet you could use these systems to test it, though.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. And we're pretty much out of time, but I do want to ask this last question. And that is, have you seen a reduction in length of stay after implementing this program?
I haven't looked. Yeah, that would be a great thing to look at. Now, of course, there's so many things in a shelter that make length of stay complicated. Like if you're comparing 1 year to another year, and 1 year, let's say, had a pandemic in it, like those 2 years of data aren't necessarily comparable. Or if you're considering whether the animal's length of stay in the shelter versus shelter and foster can complicate pictures for a number of reasons. They get more socialization in a foster home if it's, a foster home that's following instructions, which they all do, of course. And also, we often get better pictures and better bios from cats in foster. So sometimes that can influence whether they're going to be adopted more quickly. Yeah, I would love to think hard about whether or not that's something I could pull from the data. I'm interested.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis. I'm just going to end with one of the many positive comments in the chat. And this one is from Kim, who said, this is groundbreaking work. Bravo, with a hand clap. You're getting lots of hand claps right now. And she says, I am tempted to move to Toronto to work with this brilliant woman and program. So thank you.
Thank you all. I was so excited to be invited to present today, and I'm just so chuffed to hear people are as excited about this as I am.
Yay. Well, thank you, Dr. Ellis, and thanks to all of you for watching today's webcast. Dr. Ellis will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue this discussion. If you have other questions, feel free to post there. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.